Hey everybody, welcome to part 2 on this short series on the Saturn Instrument Unit Mod 410 Remote Digital Multiplexer. Last time we talked about what this thing is and how it works at a high level. We also opened it up, pulled out all the cards, and powered on the power supply card. This time we're going to go through all of the timing cards, but before we do that, I want to start with a correction, which is that I actually can remove the bottom cover on this box. It's just a bit sticky, and I didn't try hard enough. So I have all the screws out. Let me go ahead and pull it off for you. We can take a look at the backplane here. The backplane is pretty interesting. Let me zoom in. It's actually pretty cool looking. There's a lot of flex cables coming in from the connectors, and they're sort of layered. And there's a very large amount of conformal coating. These sandwiches of flex cables are just completely drenched. There's just a big glob of conformal coating here to keep it all, structurally sound, and it's, not going to move it anywhere at all. Most of the traces for the backplane are on this side of the board. There's a few on the other side, but they managed to do it largely single layer. So I'll just spin this around. You can kind of get different angles on the backplane here. But yeah, I didn't have much to say about it, but I did want to show it on the video because it's cool, and I wanted to photograph this thing as much as I could. So anyways, let's get on with the cards. The next cards that we're going to look at are Timing 1 and Timing 2. Together these generate the clocks and read pulses and write pulses and clear pulses to all the rest of the cards in the Mod 410. In order to generate that, they take in a 3600 pulse per second clock and also a 4 pulse per second frame sync from the PCM. Now exactly what each one of these two cards does is not actually super clear. They're usually drawn as a single box in the block diagrams. It might be that Timing 2 is able to run without Timing 1, but these aren't copy-pasted from the Mod 410 like other cards, or from the PCM like other cards, rather. And also they use some of these little potted modules that the computer interface unit did not use, which means we don't have full schematics for the modules on these cards. What I can tell you is that Timing 1 has an interesting thing, this little pulse transformer. This is what pulses out the telemetry sync pulse to the LVDA for the Mod 410 that's used in the LVDA-LVDC telemetry configuration. It has a little transistor driver for the pulse transformer there. But aside from that, honestly, I'm not sure what these two cards do, piece by piece. They just sort of act as a pair. And so for the purposes of this restoration, that's what I'm going to do, is I'm going to plug both of these in at the same time and then make sure that together they're generating all the correct signals for the rest of the cards. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, I've got the timing cards installed in the Mod 410, but now we have a question, which is, what inputs do we have to give them to get them to work? We know there are two signals that go into this connector, a 3600 pulse per second and a 4 pulse per second clock, but what about their duty cycle? What about their phasing? What about their voltage? Charlie Bell has some answers for us. Not all the answers, but some. In this little set of computer interface unit schematics. So the first couple of pages of this are exactly that. They're just schematics for the computer interface unit. But the third sheet has waveforms, both internal to and external to the computer interface unit. And you can see on the second line, we have our 3.2 kilocycle sync. That looks just like a square wave, that's easy enough. And then the 4 pulse per second sync is the fourth line there. And you can see that the rising edge of the 4 pulse per second sync is synchronous with the falling edge of the 3600 pulse per second. And also it lasts for basically one period of the 3600 pulse per second sync. So that tells us the time settings of our signal, and I've gone ahead and programmed that into my function generator here, as you can see. So we have a 3600 pulse per second sync in yellow and a 4 pulse per second sync in pink. This should be enough to get us going. Not so sure about the voltage. The stage design document has an output spec of at least 3.9 volts for the PCM. I suspect they were 5, but I don't think I have solid evidence of that. But the way that I did it originally was basically to just start at 1 volt and then creep them up until they started to do things, and then add a little bit of margin on top of that, and then you find a good working voltage that way. So that's what I'm going to do again now. Is I'm probably going to start at 1 volt and just creep it up, but I need to make another harness to connect to this connector. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll be right back. All right, harness has been built. Just 4 wires. We have our 3600 pulse per second sync, our 4 pulse per second sync, and then a couple of returns. I've also taken the liberty of adding a couple more test points to the box. Alright, let me get this plugged in here. We have our 3600 pulse per second sync, return, and a 4 pulse per second sync. Okay. So, let's get this turned on. Now, as you can see, our various test points here have settled into different levels. Specifically, channel 3 is high. I'm going to go ahead and turn on at 1 volt our 3600 pulse per second sync and our 4 pulse per second sync. And you can see the signal generator putting out a little bit of a signal there, but nothing is happening yet on channel 3 or channel 4. So I'm going to bump these guys up to 2 volts. And I think I should be able to... Yeah, okay. So we're triggering on our channel 4 now. Or sorry, channel 2, our 4 pulse per second sync. So I'm going to continue bumping these up. 3 volts. We actually do start to get a little bit of activity on channels 3 and 4. And I don't believe we're actually going to be able to see anything yet happen as a result of bumping up our 4 pulse per second sync. But let's dial in the responsiveness, I guess, to the 3600 pulse per second voltage level. So I'm going to go back down from 3 volts. Looks like 2.6 volts is when it cuts out. So our 3600 pulse per second sync needs to be at least 2.7 volts. But also, if you watch, I'll zoom in a little bit here. If you watch as I increase the amplitude, you can see the duty cycle changing a little bit, and it continues to do so up until I make it to about 3.6 volts. And we know from the stage spec, that the stage design document, that this should be at least 3.9 volts. So it looks like 4 volts is actually going to be a good, safe level for us to set this at. So I'm going to put my function generator at 4 volts for both channels, and we'll move on from there. So taking a look at what I have on the scope, again, the first 2 channels are just what I'm driving into it from the function generator, our 3600 pulse per second clock and our 4 pulse per second sync. These two signals that I am probing, coming from inside the box, these are being generated by one of the timer cards. It's the one in slot 10. No. Yes. The one in slot 10, which means this is timer 2 doing this. And so what it's doing, seemingly, is it's just putting out essentially two phases of the 3600 pulse per second clock. It's driving them out at about 5.2, 5.3 volts, which is actually a pretty nice standard-ish sort of logic level, somewhat unusual for Apollo equipment. But so far everything looks good. There's several more signals that these things put out, and I'm out of scope channels. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over most of the signals to digital probes. So we can take a look at a lot more of what's going on with these two cards and the rest of the box at the same time. So let me do that, and we'll start taking a look at even more signals. Alright, I've switched over to digital probes for everything and have added a whole bunch more test points so we can see exactly what the timing modules are doing here. And in the process I've learned a lot. I found some things that I had reverse engineered incorrectly the first time around, some things I didn't fully understand that I now do, and I now know exactly what timing 2 and timing 1 do. So let's get this thing turned on. So power on, 3600 pulse per second sync, 4 pulse per second sync. I'll go ahead and trigger on that 4 pulse per second sync. And this is what we have going on in the box now, just with our two timing cards. So, as with before, the first two traces are the 3600 pulse per second sync and the 4 pulse per second sync. The next two are the clocks that we already looked at. Based off of where they go in the box and the block diagrams we have, I've named the in-phase clock signal group A and the out-of-phase clock signal group B. So just to keep in mind what that means when I talk about the group A and group B clocks later. So these two, the in-phase and out-of-phase clocks, are being generated by timing 2, as well as this counter reset pulse here. So this counter reset pulse is run to all of the counters and will reset them back to 0. It is apparently edge triggered. If we zoom in, it's a little like 4 microsecond pulse that's generated right after the rising edge of the 4 pulse per second sync. So just a little tiny active low pulse that will reset all the counters, and it's generated, if I zoom out, zoom out, you can see it generated once every time we get the 4 pulse per second sync. So these three signals are all being generated by timing 2. The next three are what timing 1 does. So timing 1 is generating the write, clear, and read pulses. These go to the magnetic core registers and to the parallel storage register. So if we zoom in, let's take a look at one of these sequences here. So the basic idea is that the write pulse is going to cause any magnetic core register, any MCR that it is routed to through the patches, it will cause that MCR to latch all 10 of its input bits into its magnetic cores. Right after the write is done, the parallel storage register is commanded to clear its current contents. And then once it's done clearing, a read pulse is generated, which will cause whatever MCR that's routed to, again through the patches, to emit the contents of their cores, which will be latched into the parallel storage register, which has just been cleared. So this is happening sort of right in the middle of the group B clock, and right in the middle of the group A clock. Interestingly, the right clear read is happening at 7,200 hertz. And we're only giving the box a 3,600 pulse per second clock. So it's sampling everything twice as quickly as the clock we're giving it, which is kind of interesting. And it's always aligned right in the middle of the clock to make sure that everything is nice and stable when we do our sampling and our writing out to the PCM. So aside from the sync to the LVDA, which I can't show you because this is a Skylab box, so it's not wired in this box. This is everything that the timing 1 and timing 2 cards do. And this will form the basis for what we feed into all of the counters, which we're going to look at next. The first counters we're going to look at are the 6 counter and the 5 counter, which, as you might be able to tell, are very nearly identical, with the exception of this jumper. It's connected one way for the 6 counter and the other way for the 5 counter. The way that these cards work is they have 3 flip-flops that are wired as a binary counter that just counts 0, 1, 2, 3. And then they have decoding logic to split that into 5 or 6 different waveforms. So that little jumper is essentially connected to the reset for those flip-flops. So in the 5 counter case, it will reset the flip-flops when it reaches 5, and in the 6 counter case, it will reset the flip-flops when the count reaches 6. And that's pretty much all there is to it. I'm showing both of these at the same time because they are the same card, sans the jumper. But I'm just going to plug one in at a time. We'll put in the 6 counter and show what it looks like on the scope, and then we'll move on to the 5 counter. Okay, 6 counter is installed. I've also changed our test points here. We've graduated from looking at our inputs, so now the top 2 traces are the group A clock, which is the in phase one, and the 4 pulse per second reset. And then I have the 6 outputs of our 6 counter. So let's get this thing turned on. Power up. 3.6K sync. 4 pulse per second. And normal. Alright, there we go. So as you can see, it's taking in the group A clock and dividing it into 6 phases. And if you can kind of see our little reset signal there, the 6-1 phase always starts right at that reset. So to illustrate the usage of that counter reset pulse, what I'm going to do is turn off the function generator, hit single. I'm going to disconnect the harness for the 4 pulse per second sync, turn the 3600 pulse per second back on, and so now its phasing should be random compared to what it was before. Turn on the 4 pulse per second sync, and then I'm going to reconnect the wire here, and we had become out of sync with the theoretical PCM that is my function generator. We were on count 4 when the counter reset arrived, and so instead of going to 5 and then to 6 like usual, we jumped back up to 6-1. The reason that this is useful is that 3600 hertz for the main clock divided by 4 pulses per second for the frame sync is 900 clocks. And 900 clocks is still a very highly divisible number. It's divisible by 6, by 5, by 10, by 3, by 30, essentially all of the counters that we have in the mod 410. And so by resetting all of the counters to 1 when the 4 hertz sync comes in, we can guarantee basically that they'll also be 1 by the time the next one comes in, or they'll be forced back to 1. But they should already be 1 naturally because of the divisibility. And so it's in this way that the mod 410 and the PCM are able to agree about what samples are on the bus between them at what time. Okay, so the 5 counter. This card did not work when I tried to power it up the first time. I don't have any pictures or video, but what it was doing was basically the 5.1 output was just giving little tiny brief blips, and the 5.2 through 5.4 outputs were doing absolutely nothing. And so there's some obvious culprits on this board if you're familiar with Apollo hardware restoration. It's a big string of diodes, and if you take a look, this one is different from all the others. So as soon as I found the failure, I began suspecting the diodes, because it's always the diodes with Apollo. So I just went down checking that each one was behaving as a diode, and sure enough, our friend CR11 was not. So what I did is I scraped off the conformal coating, desoldered the diode, replaced it. We talked about foreshadowing earlier. This is the CIU schematics, but you can see the note here. All diodes are SM1N914. It's my current understanding that the 6751 diodes in Block 1 Apollo guidance computer hardware, or prototype Block 2, are also 1N914. They're the diodes that got banned from the Apollo guidance computer. And so it's kind of fascinating that they're still here in the Skylab hardware. I guess the memo didn't get passed on that these diodes sucked to the Saturn people. But anyways, here's the diode. We'll take a quick look at it under the microscope, but this thing is no longer dioding. So I don't have any sort of fancy microscope camera adapter or macro lens, so this is a sort of DSLR pressed up against the microscope eyepiece situation. So anyways, this is the diode. Honestly, I don't really see anything wrong with it. I don't know what I would be looking for exactly, but there's no like very obvious large cracks or anything like that on the glass body. And the wafer that you can see right in the middle of it seems fine, I think. But again, I don't know really what I would be looking for. So if any of you see something visually wrong with this diode, let me know. And to show you what it's doing, it has a really small forward voltage this way, and if I can get it, a slightly less small but still small forward voltage the other way. So it's kind of acting like a bidirectional diode with super small forward voltages. Definitely not usable as a diode, so had to be replaced. All right, the repaired 5 counter is installed, so let's turn it on. All right, there we go. So, as you can see, it is dividing the group A clock by 5 into 5 phases. Not a lot else to say about it. It's the same thing as the 6 counter, it's just dividing by 5 instead of 6. The next card is the 3 counter, also known as the divide by 3 card. I'll let you guess what this divides the group A clock by. That's right, it's 90. What this card actually does is, in addition to the group A clock, it takes in the 5-5 phase from the 5 counter and the 6-6 phase from the 6 counter and ANDs them together with the clock, which effectively divides it by 30, resulting in a 120 pulse per second pulse train. That is what is divided by 3. So 120 divided by 3 is 40 pulses per second. So this divide by 3 counter is going to actually put out 3 phases of 40 pulses per second. So I put in the 3 counter, a little update on what all is in the box. Interestingly, we had to skip a slot that the 10 counter goes into, but the 10 counter needs the 3 counter to work, so we had to go a little bit out of order here. So let's get this thing powered up with the 3 counter in there, and give it power and clocks. So the first two traces are as they were before. We have the Group A clock and the 4 pulse per second reset. The next two that I'm showing are the 5th phase of the 5 counter and the 6th phase of the 6 counter. And you can see wherever they overlap, we get a pulse. This is the divide by 30. So this is 120 pulses per second. And then that is used to trigger the 3 counter, which is slow enough that it's not really showing up well on this scale. So you can see wherever we get a 120 pulse per second pulse from the divide by 30, the 3 counter moves on to the next phase. So we've got 120 pulses per second here, and then each one of these are 40 pulses per second. We're on to the last counter. This is the 10 counter. This one actually does divide by 10. However, what it divides by 10 is the divided by 30 output of the 3 counter, which is why we had to do the 3 counter first. So, in effect, this module, in combination with the 3 counter, divides the input clock by a whopping 300, getting us all the way down to 12 pulses per second on each of its 10 outputs. I really appreciate, by the way, the author of the schematic of this for this board that's shown in the stage design document, who very clearly saw how this thing was designed and all of the diodes that it took to make the decoding matrix, and thought, I'm not drawing that, and just put down a box that says 30 diodes. Anyways, let's get this thing turned on. Last counter is installed. Let's get this thing fired up. Power and clocks. So the top two traces here have changed a little bit. I've still got the Group A clock on top, but I had to replace the counter reset pulse with the external 4 pulse per second sync. The reason for that is that I don't have access to the backplane. So all of these test points that I've been adding, I'm adding to unpopulated connectors for cards that I don't have installed currently. Now that all of the counters are in, a lot of the sort of inter-counter signals and things that the timing cards send only to the counters, I don't have access to anymore. So the internal counter reset pulse is gone. I also can't show you the divide by 30 signal coming out of the 3 counter, even though that's what this 10 counter is actually dividing. So we're very zoomed in right now. This is one of the zoom levels we started at. And for the 10 counter, because it's really a divide by 300 counter, I have to zoom way out. There we go. So, as expected, lined up with our external 4 pulse per second sync, which resets the counters, we go to the first stage of the 10 counter, and then it goes through 10 stages before wrapping back around to its first stage. So, that means all of the counters are working, all of them are putting out all of their clock phases, so now we get to move on to non-counter things, the more interesting parts of the Mod 410. But we're going to have to save those interesting things for next time, because this part has also gotten quite long. Next time, unless I fall into a rabbit hole, we'll look at all the rest of the cards and put it all back together. So, thanks for watching, and I will see you then.